Good evening, dear listeners. Welcome to this quiet space we share together, a sanctuary from the busy world beyond. Tonight, we're going to embark on a very special journey through time, but first I want you to get comfortable. Really comfortable. Adjust your pillow, let your shoulders drop, allow your body to sink deeper into whatever surface is supporting you right now. Take a slow, deep breath in through your nose. Hold it for just a moment. Now release it gently through your mouth, letting go of any tension you've been carrying. Do this again. Breathe in and breathe out. One more time. Feel yourself becoming heavier, more relaxed, more present in this moment. Tonight's story is about one of humanity's most enduring mysteries, a legend that has captured imaginations for more than 2,000 years. We're going to explore the story of Atlantis, not as an adventure filled with excitement and drama, but as a gentle, flowing river of history and ideas. We'll follow this river from its source in ancient Athens, through centuries of interpretation and reimagining, all the way to the world we know today. Before we begin, if you enjoy these journeys through history's mysteries and want to explore more stories like this, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us create more of these peaceful explorations into the past, and it ensures you won't miss future episodes where we'll uncover other fascinating legends and forgotten tales. You don't need to remember every detail. You don't need to stay alert or take notes. In fact, I encourage you to let the words wash over you like gentle waves lapping at a shore. If you drift away into sleep at any point, that's perfectly fine. That's exactly what should happen. This story will be here, a soft companion to guide you into rest. The beauty of the Atlantis legend is how it has meant different things to different people across the ages. To some, it was a philosophical teaching tool. To others, a real lost civilization. To many more, it became a symbol of human ambition, of what we might achieve and what we might lose. But tonight, it's simply a story, a long and winding path through human thought and imagination. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of the Mediterranean Sea on a warm evening, thousands of years ago. The sun is setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. The water stretches out before you, calm and inviting, its surface catching the fading light. This is where our story begins, in the ancient world, in a time when philosophy and myth were woven together, when stories carried layers of meaning that went far beyond simple entertainment. As we journey together through the centuries, I want you to picture yourself as a traveler through time, moving effortlessly from one era to the next. You're not rushing. There's no urgency. You're simply drifting, observing, allowing the currents of history to carry you gently forward. With each breath you take, you're becoming more relaxed, more at ease, more ready to receive whatever rest your body and mind need tonight. The story of Atlantis is, at its heart, a story about stories themselves. It's about how humans create narratives to make sense of the world, to teach lessons, to dream of possibilities. It's about how a single idea, planted by one man in one place, can grow and spread and transform across millennia, taking on new forms, new meanings, new life in each generation that encounters it. So settle in deeper now. Let your eyelids grow heavy. Feel the weight of your body becoming one with the bed beneath you. Your breathing is slow and steady, your mind is beginning to quiet. We're about to begin our journey into the past, to meet the man who first told the world about a magnificent island civilization that disappeared beneath the waves in a single day and night of catastrophe. Are you ready? Then let us begin. To understand the story of Atlantis, we must first understand the world that gave it birth. We must travel back to Athens in the 4th century before the Common Era, to a time when the city-state stood as a beacon of learning and philosophy in the ancient Mediterranean world. Athens in the 300s before the Common Era was a place of extraordinary intellectual ferment. The Persian Wars were memory now, part of the glorious past that Athenians looked back upon with pride. The great age of Pericles had come and gone. The devastating Peloponnesian War with Sparta had shattered Athens' dominance, but the city remained a center of thought, debate, and education. In the streets and marketplaces, in the gymnasiums and symposia, people discussed everything from politics to ethics, from the nature of reality to the best way to live a human life. It was into this world that Plato was born, probably around 428 or 427 before the Common Era. His birth name was Aristocles, but he would become known by a nickname that might have referred to his broad shoulders or his broad forehead. The name Plato would become synonymous with philosophy itself, one of the most influential thinkers the world has ever known. Plato came from an aristocratic family. His lineage connected him to some of the most prominent figures in Athenian society. Through his mother's side, he was related to Solon, the famous lawmaker who had lived 2 centuries earlier, a man who would play an important role in the Atlantis story. This connection to Solon wasn't just a matter of family pride. In the ancient world, such connections meant access to stories, to traditions, to knowledge passed down through generations. When Plato was in his 20s, he encountered the man who would change his life forever. Socrates was unlike any teacher Athens had known. He didn't write books or give lectures. Instead, he wandered the city, engaging anyone who would talk with him in deep, probing conversations. He asked questions that seemed simple on the surface but led to profound examinations of fundamental concepts. What is justice? What is virtue? What is knowledge itself? Socrates' method was to claim ignorance and then, through careful questioning, to show that others who claimed to know didn't really understand what they thought they understood. This made him beloved by some, especially young men like Plato, but hated by others who felt humiliated or threatened by his questioning. The powerful in Athens saw Socrates as a corrupter of youth, a dangerous influence who undermined traditional values and beliefs. In 399 before the Common Era, when Plato was about 28 years old, Athens put Socrates on trial. The charges were impiety and corrupting the youth. The trial was a travesty of justice, driven more by political motivations than genuine concern for the city's welfare. Socrates was found guilty and sentenced to death. He could have fled into exile, but he chose to accept the verdict and drink the hemlock poison, dying among his friends and students. This event profoundly shaped Plato. The death of Socrates at the hands of Athenian democracy filled him with disillusionment about the political system. He had seen the city he loved condemn the wisest man he knew. This experience would inform all of his later work, including his thoughts about ideal societies and the nature of justice. After Socrates' death, Plato traveled extensively throughout the Mediterranean. He visited Megara, Cyrene in North Africa, Italy, and Sicily. These journeys exposed him to different cultures, different philosophical traditions, different ways of organizing society. He encountered Pythagorean communities in southern Italy, with their emphasis on mathematics and mysticism. He witnessed tyranny in Syracuse and the complex politics of Greek city-states beyond Athens. When he returned to Athens around 387 before the Common Era, Plato founded his academy. This wasn't a school in the modern sense, but rather a community of scholars dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge. Located in a grove sacred to the hero Academus, northwest of Athens, the academy would endure for nearly 900 years, becoming the longest-lived institution of higher learning in the ancient world. At the academy, Plato taught through dialogue and discussion, carrying forward Socrates' method. But unlike Socrates, Plato also wrote. He created philosophical dialogues, dramatic works in which characters debated and explored ideas. These weren't dry treatises but living conversations, filled with personality and drama. In nearly all of them, Socrates appeared as the main character, asking his penetrating questions, leading others toward insight. Plato's dialogues covered an extraordinary range of topics. In the Republic, his most famous work, he explored the nature of justice and described an ideal city-state ruled by philosopher kings. In the Symposium, he examined the nature of love through a series of speeches at a drinking party. In the Phaedo, he presented Socrates' final hours and arguments for the immortality of the soul. Each dialogue was crafted not just to convey information but to make readers think, to engage them in the same kind of questioning that Socrates had practiced. The dialogues were literary as well as philosophical achievements. Plato was a master of Greek prose, capable of creating vivid scenes, memorable characters, and beautiful imagery. He used myths and allegories to illustrate complex philosophical points. The most famous of these is probably the allegory of the cave from the Republic, in which prisoners chained in a cave mistake shadows on the wall for reality, unaware of the true world outside. But Plato's methods went beyond simple storytelling. He understood that people learn best when they're engaged, when they must work through ideas themselves rather than passively receiving them. His dialogues often ended without definitive conclusions, forcing readers to continue thinking about the questions raised. This was intentional. Philosophy, for Plato, wasn't about memorizing answers. It was about developing the capacity to think clearly and deeply about fundamental questions. As Plato grew older, his thinking evolved. His later dialogues showed increasing interest in cosmology, in the nature and structure of the physical universe. He grappled with questions about how the world came to be, what it was made of, and how it functioned. These were questions that philosophers before him had asked, but Plato brought new sophistication to them, drawing on his theory of forms and his mathematical interests. It's important to understand that in Plato's worldview, there was no sharp distinction between what we would call mythology and what we would call philosophy or science. Stories about gods and heroes weren't simply entertainment or superstition. They could contain profound truths, though those truths might be expressed symbolically rather than literally. A myth could teach important lessons about ethics, about the nature of reality, about the proper way to live. This context is essential for understanding why and how Plato created the story of Atlantis. When he sat down to write the Timaeus and Critias dialogues in his 60s or early 70s, he was an old man, the head of a famous philosophical school, with decades of teaching and writing behind him. He had thought deeply about politics, ethics, cosmology, and education. He had seen both the heights and depths of human society. The Athens of Plato's later years was not the mighty empire it had once been. The city had lost its war with Sparta. It had seen oligarchy and restored democracy. It had executed Socrates and struggled with internal divisions. Plato had watched all of this, had thought about what made society succeed or fail, about what justice really meant in practice, about whether there could ever be a truly ideal state. Athens itself was layered with history and mythology. The Athenians told stories about their origins, about how they were autochthonous, sprung from the very soil of Attica. They told stories about their early kings, including Theseus, who had unified Attica under Athenian rule. They had their own glorious past to look back upon, including the victory over the Persians at Marathon and Salamis, when small Greek forces had defeated the massive armies and navies of the Persian Empire. These stories of Athenian greatness served important functions. They helped create a sense of identity and pride. They provided models of virtue and courage. They explained why Athens was special, why it deserved to lead the Greek world. Every citizen of Athens grew up hearing these stories, absorbing them as part of their cultural inheritance. Plato knew the power of such stories. He had used myths and allegories throughout his philosophical works. But he also knew their limitations. Stories could inspire, but they could also deceive. They could point toward truth, but they could also lead people astray if taken too literally or interpreted wrongly. In the world of Plato's Athens, education was primarily conducted through oral tradition and discussion. Books existed, written on papyrus scrolls, but they were expensive and rare. Most people encountered ideas through listening and conversation rather than reading. Teachers taught their students face to face. Philosophers gathered disciples who learned by listening to their master and engaging in dialogue. This oral culture meant that stories could be adapted, embellished, and reshaped as they were passed from person to person, generation to generation. A story told by a grandfather to his grandson might change slightly in the telling. Details might be added or removed. The emphasis might shift. This was not seen as dishonesty but as the natural way stories lived and breathed through a culture. Plato understood this fluid nature of oral tradition. He also understood something else crucial. People remembered stories far better than they remembered abstract arguments. A vivid narrative, filled with concrete details and dramatic events, would stick in the mind in a way that a philosophical treatise might not. If you wanted to teach important lessons that people would remember and pass on, wrapping those lessons in a compelling story was an effective approach. So when Plato set out to write the Timaeus dialogue, which would contain the first mention of Atlantis, he brought together all of these elements. His philosophical sophistication, his understanding of Athenian identity and mythology, his skill as a literary craftsman, his awareness of how stories functioned in an oral culture, his desire to teach important lessons about politics, ethics, and the nature of reality. The stage was set for the creation of one of history's most enduring legends. An old philosopher in Athens, thinking about ideal societies and their downfall, about the proper relationship between humans and the divine, about the cyclical nature of civilization, about the lessons of history real and imagined, sat down to write. What emerged would still be captivating imaginations more than 2,000 years later, long after Athens itself had faded from greatness, long after the academy had closed its doors, long after Plato's name had become legendary. The story of Atlantis appears in two of Plato's dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias. These works were written late in Plato's life, probably in the 360s before the Common Era. They were meant to be part of a trilogy with a third dialogue called the Hermocrates to follow, but this final work was either never written or has been lost to history. The Timaeus dialogue opens with Socrates recounting a conversation from the previous day, in which he had described an ideal state. This is almost certainly a reference to the Republic, Plato's great work on justice and the ideal city. Socrates expresses a wish to see this ideal state in action, engaged in war or commerce with other states, to see how it would actually function in practice. Hermocrates, one of the participants in the dialogue, responds that Critias knows a perfect story for this purpose. This Critias is not the famous tyrant who would later be one of the 30 tyrants of Athens, but likely his grandfather, though scholars have debated this identification for generations. The historical details matter less than the narrative frame Plato creates. Critias proceeds to tell a remarkable story. He says that when his great-grandfather Dropides was young, he heard it from his own grandfather, who was a close friend of Solon. Solon was the great Athenian lawmaker who had lived about 2 centuries before Plato's time, around 600 before the Common Era. Solon was revered in Athens as one of the 7 wise men of Greece, a poet and statesman who had reformed Athenian law and set the city on a path toward democracy. According to Critias, Solon had traveled to Egypt late in his life. Egypt was ancient even to the Greeks, its civilization stretching back thousands of years. In the city of Sais in the Nile Delta, Solon engaged in conversation with Egyptian priests. These priests, Critias says, revealed to Solon a story that had been preserved in their records but forgotten by the Greeks. The priests told Solon that the Greeks were like children with no deep knowledge of the past. Whenever civilization advanced, they said, catastrophic events would destroy human societies, leaving only scattered survivors to start over. Writing and other arts would be lost, and people would have to rediscover everything. This had happened many times throughout history. The Greeks only remembered the most recent cycle. But in Egypt, the priests claimed, records had been kept for thousands of years, preserved from these periodic destructions. And in these records was an astonishing story about Athens itself, about a time 9,000 years before Solon's visit, when Athens had been the greatest city in the world. This ancient Athens, the priests said, had been founded by the goddess Athena herself. It had perfect laws and institutions. Its citizens were virtuous and courageous, trained in all the arts of war and peace. The city was everything Solon, and by extension Plato, could imagine a perfect state to be. It was, in fact, remarkably similar to the ideal city Socrates had described in the Republic. But this ancient Athens faced a great threat. In those days, there existed a vast island empire beyond the Pillars of Heracles. The Pillars of Heracles were what we know today as the Strait of Gibraltar, the narrow passage between the Mediterranean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean. Beyond them, in the Atlantic itself, lay this great island. The island was called Atlantis, named after Atlas, the titan who held up the sky in Greek mythology. Atlantis was enormous, larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined. But it wasn't just the island itself that constituted the empire. The Atlanteans ruled over many other islands beyond it, and they had extended their control even into the Mediterranean itself, conquering Libya as far as Egypt and Europe as far as Tyrrhenia, which was roughly the area of modern Tuscany in Italy. The Atlantean Empire, grown powerful and rich, became arrogant and aggressive. They mounted an invasion to conquer the rest of the Mediterranean, including Athens and the other free cities of the region. All the other Greek cities abandoned Athens in fear, but the Athenians stood alone. Through their superior virtue, courage, and military skill, they defeated the vast Atlantean forces and freed all the peoples who had been enslaved. But then came catastrophe. In a single day and night, terrible earthquakes and floods struck. The Athenian army was swallowed by the earth, and the island of Atlantis itself sank beneath the sea, vanishing completely. Ever since, the priests said, the sea in that area remained impassable because of the mud and shoals left by the sunken island. This was the story as told in the Timaeus. It was brief, just a few pages in modern editions, but it was vivid and memorable. Plato then devoted the rest of the Timaeus dialogue to a long cosmological discourse by the character Timaeus about the creation and structure of the universe. This discourse, filled with complex philosophical and mathematical ideas, was actually the main purpose of the dialogue. The Atlantis story was essentially a prologue, a way to introduce the themes and set the stage. But Plato wasn't finished with Atlantis. In the Critias dialogue, which presumably followed soon after, he returned to the story and told it in much greater detail. The Critias picks up where the Timaeus left off, with the character Critias now elaborating on the tale he had summarized earlier. Critias begins by describing how the gods divided the earth among themselves in the distant past. The goddess Athena received Athens as her portion, while the god Poseidon received Atlantis. On this island, Poseidon found a mortal woman named Cleito, daughter of Evenor and Leucippe. Poseidon fell in love with her and made her his wife. To protect Cleito, Poseidon created a dwelling place for her on a hill in the center of the island. He surrounded this hill with alternating rings of sea and land, 2 rings of land and 3 rings of water, each perfectly circular and regular. These rings were so perfectly made that no ship of that time could pass through them. Poseidon and Cleito had 5 sets of twin sons, 10 princes who would become the first rulers of Atlantis. The eldest, named Atlas, became the first king and gave his name to the island and to the ocean surrounding it. The island was divided into 10 portions, 1 for each prince, but Atlas and his descendants held supreme authority. Now Plato, through Critias, launches into an extraordinarily detailed description of Atlantis. This wasn't vague mythological scene setting. These were precise measurements, architectural details, geographical specifications. It's this level of detail that would later convince many people that Atlantis must have been real. The central island where Poseidon had placed Cleito was about 5 stadia in diameter. A stadion was a Greek unit of length, roughly 185 meters or 600 feet, so this central island was just under 1 kilometer across. Around it were the alternating rings of water and land that Poseidon had created. The Atlanteans, over many generations, enhanced these natural features. They bridged the rings of water, creating passages for ships to sail through from the outer ocean to the central island. They dug a great canal from the sea to the outermost ring of water. They built walls around each ring of land and they covered these walls with metals. The outermost wall was plated with brass. The middle wall was plated with tin. The wall around the central island, the Acropolis where the royal palace stood, was covered with a mysterious metal called orichalc, which gleamed like fire and was the second most precious substance on the island after gold. On the central island stood the palace of the kings and the temple of Poseidon. The temple was immense, a stadium in length 300 feet wide and proportionally high. Its exterior was covered entirely in silver, except for the pinnacles, which were covered in gold. Inside, the ceiling was of ivory inlaid with gold, silver, and orichalc. The walls, columns, and floor were similarly adorned. At the center of the temple stood a golden statue of Poseidon himself, depicted driving a chariot pulled by 6 winged horses, so tall that his head touched the ceiling. Around him were 100 nereids riding dolphins. The Atlanteans had placed this statue there, along with many other offerings from private citizens. Around the temple was a sacred grove and buildings for priests. Beyond this were exercise grounds and racecourses. All around the outer rings were dockyards, warehouses, and arsenals. The harbors were full of ships and merchants from all over the world, drawn by Atlantis's great wealth. Beyond the city itself, on the main island of Atlantis, lay a great rectangular plain, one of the wonders of their civilization. This plain measured 3,000 stadia in length and 2,000 stadia in width, making it roughly the size of several modern countries combined. The plain was surrounded by mountains which protected it from northern winds. It was said to be the most beautiful and fertile plain in the entire world. The Atlanteans had performed immense works of engineering on this plain. They had dug a great canal all around it, running along the mountains. This canal was 100 feet deep, a stadium in width, and over 10,000 stadia in length, making it one of the largest engineering projects in the ancient world, if it had existed. From this canal, they dug smaller channels across the plain in a grid pattern. These channels served both for irrigation and for timber transport. During rainy seasons, water from the mountains would flow into the canals and be distributed across the farmland. The produce of this plain and of the rest of the island was abundant beyond measure. The plain was divided into sections, each under the control of a local leader. In time of war, each section was required to provide a certain number of soldiers and equipment. The military organization of Atlantis was sophisticated and powerful. The island could field enormous armies and a navy of 1,200 ships. Plato describes the natural resources of Atlantis in loving detail. The island produced everything necessary for civilized life. Timber of every kind grew in abundance. There were meadows for domesticated animals and forests with wild beasts of every sort. Most remarkably, elephants lived on Atlantis, something that would later puzzle interpreters who tried to place Atlantis in various locations. The island was rich in minerals. They mined metals from the ground, including the mysterious orichalc which existed nowhere else. They had hot and cold springs which they channeled into baths and fountains. They grew every kind of food crop. The climate was mild and productive. For many generations the kings of Atlantis ruled wisely. They remained true to their divine heritage and followed just laws. Every 5th and 6th year alternately, they would gather to hold council and pass judgment. They would sacrifice bulls to Poseidon, mixing the blood with wine and pouring it over the pillars on which their laws were inscribed. These laws governed how the kings would treat each other and how they would conduct war. They swore to help any king threatened by others, to make decisions by majority vote, and never to make war on each other. The king from the line of Atlas had special authority, but only in concert with the other kings. As long as they maintained their divine nature and followed these laws, the Atlanteans prospered beyond measure. They possessed wisdom, virtue, and restraint. They valued righteousness over material wealth, though they had wealth in abundance. They were temperate in all things and saw clearly the true values of life. But then came the change. Over many generations, as the divine portion in their blood became diluted through repeated intermarriage with mortals, human nature began to dominate. The Atlanteans grew proud and ambitious. They began to value power and wealth for their own sake. Where they had once been noble, they became greedy. Where they had been wise, they became foolish. To those who could not perceive true virtue, they still appeared glorious and blessed, at the height of their power and prosperity. But Zeus, who could see into the hearts of humans, recognized their degradation. He decided to punish them, to bring them back to wisdom through suffering. And here, frustratingly, Plato's Critias dialogue breaks off mid-sentence. Zeus has called the gods together to pronounce judgment, but we never learn what that judgment is. The dialogue simply stops, unfinished. We know what happened, the catastrophic destruction described in the Timaeus, but we don't get the full story of how and why it unfolded from Plato's pen. This abrupt ending has puzzled scholars for centuries. Did Plato die before completing it? Did he deliberately leave it unfinished for rhetorical effect? Did he plan a third dialogue, the Hermocrates, which would complete the story but never wrote it? We cannot know with certainty. What we do know is what Plato gave us in these two dialogues. A vivid, detailed, seemingly historical account of a great island civilization that conquered much of the ancient world, then fell into moral corruption and was destroyed by the gods through a natural catastrophe. It was a story meant to illustrate important philosophical points about justice, about the dangers of imperial ambition, about the relationship between humans and the divine, about the cyclical nature of civilization. But it was also, intentionally or not, a story that felt real. The details were too specific, too precise to feel like pure allegory. The framing as ancient history recounted through multiple sources, the Egyptian priests and their records, the connection to the revered Solon, all of this gave the story a patina of authenticity. When you read Plato's account, especially the elaborate descriptions in the Critias, it doesn't feel like someone making up a fable. It feels like someone describing a real place, with the kind of specificity that comes from genuine knowledge. This realism, this wealth of detail, this careful framing within layers of historical testimony, would be crucial to Atlantis's future. Without it, the story might have been recognized universally as an allegory and forgotten after Plato's death. But because Plato made it so concrete, so seemingly factual, it would go on to inspire endless speculation, search, and debate. Even in antiquity, not everyone believed Plato's story of Atlantis was literally true. The first and most famous skeptic was Plato's own student, Aristotle. Aristotle, born in 384 before the Common Era, became a member of Plato's academy as a teenager and studied there for nearly 20 years. He was one of the most brilliant minds in Western history, eventually founding his own school, the Lyceum, and producing works on everything from biology to ethics, from physics to politics. His influence on Western thought would rival or exceed even Plato's. Aristotle knew his teacher's methods well. He understood that Plato often used myths and allegories to convey philosophical ideas. According to ancient sources, Aristotle supposedly said of Atlantis, "He who created it also destroyed it." This terse comment suggested that Aristotle believed Plato had invented Atlantis as a literary device, a fictional setting for exploring ideas about ideal and corrupt societies. Whether Aristotle actually said these exact words is uncertain, but the sentiment reflects what many ancient philosophers came to believe. They saw Atlantis as a philosophical thought experiment, not a historical account. It was a tool for teaching, not a factual record of past events. However, not all ancient thinkers were skeptics. Some believed there was historical truth in Plato's account, even if the details might have been embellished. The question became, if Atlantis was real, where had it been and what happened to it? Crantor, who lived around 300 before the Common Era and wrote one of the earliest commentaries on Plato's Timaeus, believed the story was historical. He reportedly claimed to have verified it through Egyptian sources, saying that the priests and sayas had shown him columns on which the story was recorded. Whether Crantor actually traveled to Egypt or whether he simply repeated what Plato had written is unknown. No such columns have ever been found by modern archaeologists. Posidonius, a Stoic philosopher who lived from about 135 to 51 before the Common Era, also appears to have believed in Atlantis's reality. He studied geography and natural phenomena extensively and may have thought that Plato's story preserved genuine knowledge of a lost land. Posidonius believed that continents could rise and fall due to geological processes, making the submersion of an island like Atlantis scientifically plausible. The geographer Strabo, writing around the time of Christ's birth, took a more measured view. He noted that it was possible for lands to be swallowed by the sea, citing examples of coastal areas that had been flooded within recorded history. However, he also suggested that Plato might have invented Atlantis for philosophical purposes. Strabo's careful approach, acknowledging both possibilities, reflected a more scholarly attitude than either complete belief or complete dismissal. Pliny the Elder, the Roman natural historian who died in the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 of the Common Era, mentioned Atlantis in his encyclopedic Natural History. He connected it to legends of other lost islands and lands, treating it as one among many geographical mysteries rather than as something unique or necessarily real. Plutarch, the Greek biographer and essayist of the 1st century of the Common Era, wrote about Atlantis in his Life of Solon. He presented the story much as Plato had, describing Solon's visit to Egypt and the tale the priests told him. Plutarch seemed to accept that Solon really had heard this story in Egypt, though whether he believed the story itself was true is less clear. One of the more intriguing ancient references comes from Proclus, a Neoplatonist philosopher of the 5th century of the Common Era. Proclus wrote that Crantor had mentioned seeing the pillars in Egypt where the Atlantis story was recorded. He also preserved a fragment from a lost historian named Marcellus, who supposedly claimed that 10 islands in the outer sea beyond the Pillars of Heracles had been sacred to Proserpine and that 3 others of immense size were sacred to Pluto, Ammon, and Poseidon. This last island, sacred to Poseidon, had supposedly been 10,000 stadia in length and was remembered by the inhabitants as genuinely having existed, though it had disappeared. These fragmentary references show that the question of Atlantis's reality remained alive in ancient discourse. Some dismissed it entirely as Plato's invention. Others thought there might be some historical kernel to the story. Still others fully believed it was true and even claimed to have confirmatory evidence. As Christianity spread through the Roman Empire and eventually became its official religion, the intellectual landscape changed dramatically. The works of pagan philosophers like Plato remained respected and studied, but they were now read through a Christian lens. Scholars tried to reconcile ancient philosophy with Christian theology, finding ways to make Greek wisdom compatible with biblical revelation. In this context, Atlantis took on new possible meanings. Some early Christian and medieval writers saw the flood that destroyed Atlantis as connected to, or identical with, Noah's flood described in Genesis. This interpretation allowed them to accept Atlantis as real while fitting it into the biblical timeline and understanding of world history. The 9th century Irish philosopher John Scotus Eriugena, for instance, knew Plato's Timaeus and may have contemplated the Atlantis story in relation to Christian cosmology and theology. However, direct discussions of Atlantis were relatively rare in medieval Christian thought. Most medieval scholars focused on other aspects of Plato's work, particularly those that seemed most relevant to Christian theology. Islamic scholars of the medieval period also knew Plato's works, though often through translations and commentaries rather than original Greek texts. The Atlantis story would have reached them as part of the Platonic corpus, but evidence of extensive Islamic discussion of Atlantis is limited. Islamic scholars were more interested in Plato's political philosophy and metaphysics than in geographical and historical details about a possibly mythical island. What's striking about the ancient and medieval period is that Atlantis never became a major focus of speculation or controversy. Plato's story was known and discussed, but it remained mostly a footnote to more important philosophical questions. Some people believed it, others didn't, but few devoted significant effort to proving its reality or locating its remains. This relative obscurity would change dramatically in the modern era. But in the ancient and medieval worlds, Atlantis was just one interesting story among many, one puzzle among countless others left by antiquity. It had not yet become the obsession, the symbol, the catch-all explanation for mysteries that it would later become. The medieval world, focused on Christian salvation and theological questions, had little energy for searching for lost pagan civilizations in the Atlantic Ocean. Scholars studied texts in monasteries, preserved ancient knowledge, and tried to understand God's plan for humanity. Atlantis was a curiosity, perhaps a cautionary tale about pride and divine punishment, but not a burning question demanding resolution. The physical world itself was still largely mysterious to medieval Europeans. They knew the Mediterranean well, had some knowledge of Asia through trade routes, and were beginning to explore Africa's coastlines. But the vast Atlantic Ocean remained largely uncharted, a fearsome barrier rather than a highway. Few ships ventured far from sight of land. The idea of crossing that ocean to find something on the other side seemed absurd to most people. In medieval maps, the Atlantic was often depicted as empty, a void at the edge of the known world. Sometimes mapmakers included legendary islands, drawing on ancient traditions and sailors' tales. Islands like Brazil, Antillia, and St. Brendan's Isle appeared on charts, though no one could say for certain whether they existed. Atlantis, if mentioned at all, was grouped with these phantom lands, half-believed curiosities rather than serious geographical propositions. The medieval understanding of history was also very different from ours. Time itself was compressed. The ancient world didn't seem as distant as it does to us. Only about 1,000 years separated medieval scholars from the last days of the Roman Empire, and the classical past remained vivid in art, literature, and architectural ruins. But simultaneously, the truly ancient past, the world before Rome and Greece, was vague and often mixed with biblical accounts of creation, the flood, and the Tower of Babel. In this compressed and uncertain timeline, fitting Atlantis into world history was problematic. If it had existed 9,000 years before Solon, as Plato said, that placed it long before the biblical creation of the world according to most medieval chronologies. Scholars who tried to take Atlantis seriously had to reconcile it with scripture, which usually meant either rejecting Plato's timeline or reinterpreting the story entirely. Some scholars suggested that Plato or his Egyptian sources had confused or exaggerated the numbers. Perhaps it wasn't 9,000 years before Solon but 900, or some other more manageable figure. This would place Atlantis in a more believable time frame, though it created other problems with Plato's account. Others saw the story as purely allegorical, a moral lesson wrapped in fictional history. The rise and fall of Atlantis became a warning about hubris, about what happens when civilizations turn away from virtue toward materialism and conquest. This interpretation allowed medieval readers to appreciate Plato's wisdom without having to accept the literal truth of the account. Throughout these centuries, from Plato's death to the dawn of the Renaissance, Atlantis remained in the background of Western thought. It was never forgotten but never central. The story survived because Plato's works survived, copied by scribes, studied in schools, passed down through generations. But it waited, dormant, for a new age that would give it fresh life and new meanings. That new age was coming, though the medieval scholars couldn't know it. The world was about to expand dramatically. New lands would be discovered. The Atlantic Ocean would be crossed. Ancient texts would be studied with new eyes and new purposes. And in this transformed world, the story of Atlantis would be rediscovered, reinterpreted, and invested with significance that would have amazed even Plato himself. The Renaissance brought a revolution in European thought. Scholars turned back to ancient texts with fresh enthusiasm, seeking wisdom from Greece and Rome. The invention of printing made books more widely available. Universities expanded. Wealthy patrons supported artists and thinkers. Exploration opened new horizons as European ships ventured ever farther from familiar shores. In 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed across the Atlantic and reached the Americas, though he believed he had found islands near Asia. This voyage changed everything. Suddenly, the Atlantic was no longer an impassable barrier but a route to new lands. The world was bigger and stranger than Europeans had imagined. These discoveries gave new relevance to Plato's Atlantis story. If there were vast continents across the Atlantic that the ancients had supposedly not known about, might Atlantis have been real after all? Might Plato's account preserve genuine knowledge of lands beyond the ocean? Some Renaissance thinkers began to identify Atlantis with America itself. The idea was appealing in its simplicity. Plato had described a great landmass beyond the Pillars of Heracles, in the Atlantic. Now Europeans had discovered exactly that. Perhaps the story hadn't been about an island that sank but about lands that still existed, that had simply been forgotten by Europeans. This interpretation required explaining away the destruction of Atlantis described by Plato. Some suggested the disaster had been partial rather than total, that parts of the continent remained above water. Others proposed that Plato or his sources had misunderstood what happened, that instead of sinking beneath the sea, Atlantis had simply become isolated and unknown to the Old World. The most famous Renaissance work to engage with Atlantis was actually not about the original Platonic story at all. In 1626, Francis Bacon published The New Atlantis, a utopian novel describing a fictional island called Bensalem in the Pacific Ocean. This island was home to an advanced scientific society dedicated to knowledge and the improvement of human life. Bacon's Bensalem wasn't meant to be Plato's Atlantis. The title invoked Atlantis symbolically, suggesting a new and better version of that legendary civilization. Bacon's vision was forward-looking, focused on what humanity could achieve through reason and scientific method. His New Atlantis became enormously influential, shaping ideas about scientific institutions and the potential for human progress. But Bacon's work also demonstrated Atlantis's evolving role in Western imagination. It was becoming a symbol, a name that evoked grandeur, lost wisdom, and human potential. Whether or not the original Atlantis had been real was almost beside the point. The idea of Atlantis, the concept, had power. Meanwhile, scholars continued debating the historical question. In 1675, a Swedish scholar named Olaus Rudbeck published Atland eller Mannheim, arguing that Atlantis had been located in Sweden. Rudbeck's theory was part of a broader nationalist project to glorify Swedish history and prove that Scandinavia had been the birthplace of civilization. Rudbeck's work was extraordinarily detailed, running to multiple volumes filled with linguistic, mythological, and geographical arguments. He tried to show that Plato's descriptions matched Sweden, that the Nordic peoples were descendants of the Atlanteans, and that Swedish was the original language of humanity. To modern readers, his arguments seem far-fetched, but they were taken seriously by many of his contemporaries. This Swedish Atlantis theory illustrates an important pattern that would repeat throughout Atlantis's history. People would locate Atlantis wherever they wanted to elevate or glorify. If you wanted to prove your nation or people were special, claiming Atlantean heritage was an effective approach. The lack of definitive evidence meant that almost any location could be proposed with at least some plausibility. The Enlightenment of the 18th century brought more critical, scientific approaches to historical questions. Thinkers valued reason, evidence, and careful analysis. They questioned traditional authorities and sought to build knowledge on firmer foundations. This intellectual climate was not particularly favorable to belief in Atlantis. Enlightenment thinkers tended to be skeptical of ancient myths and legends. They wanted proof, documentation, and logical consistency. Plato's Atlantis story, examined carefully, had problems. The chronology didn't work. The geography was vague. No physical evidence supported it. The French philosopher Voltaire dismissed Atlantis as pure fiction. The British philosopher John Locke never took it seriously. The historians of the Enlightenment focused on documented, verifiable events rather than legendary catastrophes. However, not all Enlightenment thinkers rejected Atlantis. Some saw value in investigating the story as a possible historical memory, even if embellished or distorted. The question became, what kernel of truth, if any, might lie behind Plato's tale? Some scholars proposed that Atlantis might have been based on real places or events that Plato learned about and incorporated into his philosophical narrative. Perhaps Egyptian priests had told stories about ancient disasters in the Mediterranean, and Plato had woven these into his account. Perhaps there had been a real war between Athens and some maritime power, transformed in Plato's retelling into the Atlantis story. These attempts to find a rational, historical basis for the Atlantis legend while acknowledging that Plato had fictionalized it represented a middle ground between complete belief and complete dismissal. They allowed scholars to take the story seriously as a historical source while recognizing its literary and philosophical purposes. As European knowledge of the world's geography increased, the possible locations for Atlantis expanded as well. Explorers and naturalists returned from voyages with accounts of strange lands and peoples. Each new discovery might potentially relate to the Atlantis mystery. Some theorists placed Atlantis in the Caribbean, suggesting the islands there were remnants of the sunken continent. Others looked to the Mediterranean, proposing that Atlantis had been a great island there, perhaps Crete or Sardinia or Sicily, that had been destroyed by volcanic eruption or earthquake. The development of geology as a science in the 18th and 19th centuries added new dimensions to these debates. Geologists began to understand that the Earth's surface had changed dramatically over vast periods of time. Continents had shifted. Sea levels had risen and fallen. Islands had appeared and disappeared. This knowledge cut both ways regarding Atlantis. On one hand, it made the idea of a sunken island civilization more plausible. The Earth's crust was clearly not stable. Catastrophic changes had occurred. Perhaps Atlantis had been one of them. On the other hand, geological evidence showed no signs of a continent-sized landmass having existed and then sunk in the Atlantic in recent geological time. The 19th century would see both the peak of scientific skepticism about Atlantis and the beginning of its greatest period of popular fascination. These contradictory trends would shape how we think about Atlantis even today. In universities and learned societies, Atlantis was increasingly dismissed as mythology. Archaeologists were uncovering real ancient civilizations in Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, and elsewhere. They were developing rigorous methods for dating artifacts, interpreting texts, and reconstructing the past. In this context, Atlantis looked more and more like a philosophical fable that some people had mistakenly taken literally. But outside academia, in popular culture, and among amateur enthusiasts, Atlantis was becoming more fascinating than ever. The combination of ancient mystery, lost wisdom, advanced civilization, and catastrophic destruction proved irresistible to the imagination. Books and articles about Atlantis proliferated, each offering new theories, new evidence, new reasons to believe. This divergence between scholarly consensus and popular belief would become one of the defining features of the Atlantis phenomenon. The more academics dismissed it, the more attractive it became to those who distrusted academic authority or believed that conventional scholars were missing something important. The stage was set for the most influential Atlantis book ever written, a work that would shape popular understanding of the legend for generations and launch countless expeditions, theories, and fantasies. That work would appear in 1882, written by an American congressman with a passion for ancient mysteries and a gift for persuasive prose. But before we reach that pivotal moment, it's worth pausing to reflect on how far the Atlantis story had traveled. From Plato's academy in Athens to Renaissance courts, from Enlightenment salons to the libraries of the 19th century, the legend had persisted. It had been dismissed, defended, reimagined, and relocated. It had inspired utopian visions and nationalist mythologies. It had been both a serious historical puzzle and a literary symbol. Through all these transformations, certain elements remained constant. The image of a great civilization at its peak, blessed with wealth, knowledge, and power. The moral decline from virtue to corruption. The sudden, catastrophic destruction as divine punishment. These core themes resonated across cultures and centuries because they spoke to fundamental human concerns about the fragility of civilization, the dangers of hubris, and the possibility that greatness once achieved might be lost forever. As you listen to this story, let yourself drift with these currents of time. Feel the rhythm of ideas passing from generation to generation, transforming with each retelling. The story of Atlantis is like a river that has flowed for more than 2,000 years, picking up new elements along its course, depositing others, but always moving forward, always carrying something of its source along with it. Your breathing is slow and steady now. Your body is completely relaxed. The story continues to unfold, but you need not hold on to every detail. Let it wash over you like gentle waves, soothing and constant, carrying you deeper into rest. The year 1882 marked a turning point in the history of the Atlantis legend. In that year, a 51-year-old American politician and amateur historian named Ignatius Loyola Donnelly published a book titled Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. Donnelly was a fascinating character, a man of wide-ranging interests and considerable talent. He had served in the United States Congress representing Minnesota, where he championed causes ranging from civil rights for freed slaves to financial reform. He was an eloquent speaker, a prolific writer, and a man who loved grand theories and bold ideas. After leaving Congress, Donnelly turned his attention to writing. He had long been interested in ancient mysteries and catastrophic events in Earth's history. The Atlantis story, which he had read in Plato, captured his imagination. He became convinced that Atlantis had been real and that proving its existence would revolutionize our understanding of human history. Atlantis, the antediluvian world, was the result of Donnelly's research and theorizing. It was a thick volume, over 400 pages long, filled with arguments, evidence, and speculation. Donnelly wrote with confidence and passion, marshaling facts from archaeology, geology, mythology, and linguistics to support his thesis. The book's central claims were sweeping. Donnelly argued that Atlantis had been a large island in the Atlantic Ocean that had indeed existed and been destroyed by a catastrophe, just as Plato described. This civilization, he claimed, had been the true birthplace of human culture. All the great ancient civilizations, from Egypt to Peru, from Mesopotamia to India, were colonies or cultural descendants of Atlantis. According to Donnelly, the similarities between ancient cultures on both sides of the Atlantic proved they had a common source. The pyramids of Egypt and the pyramids of Mexico showed the same architectural principles because both peoples had learned from the Atlanteans. Similar flood myths appeared in cultures worldwide because all preserved memories of the catastrophe that destroyed Atlantis. Common symbols and religious ideas reflected shared Atlantean heritage. Donnelly devoted chapters to demonstrating these connections. He compared myths and legends, looking for common elements. He analyzed ancient alphabets, trying to show they derived from a single Atlantean source. He examined plant and animal distributions, arguing that certain species existed on both sides of the Atlantic because they had spread from Atlantis before its destruction. Some of Donnelly's arguments had superficial plausibility. There are indeed intriguing similarities between ancient cultures that developed independently. The question was whether these similarities required a common source like Atlantis or could be explained by universal human tendencies and independent invention. Modern scholarship has firmly established that the latter explanation is correct. Pyramids appear in different cultures not because of cultural diffusion from Atlantis but because the pyramid is a stable, impressive structure that many societies invented independently. Flood myths are widespread because floods are common and devastating natural disasters that would be remembered and recounted. Similarities in symbols often reflect basic human psychology and the shared experiences of being human rather than common cultural ancestry. But in 1882, these counterarguments were less developed. Many readers found Donnelly's case convincing, or at least fascinating. The book became a bestseller, going through numerous editions and translations. It brought Atlantis to a wide popular audience and established many of the ideas about Atlantis that persist in popular culture today. Donnelly's book had several lasting effects on the Atlantis phenomenon. First, it firmly located Atlantis in the Atlantic Ocean, usually somewhere near the mid-Atlantic ridge. Second, it portrayed Atlantis as the mother civilization of all human culture, a theme that earlier writers had touched on but that Donnelly developed comprehensively. Third, it created a template for Atlantis books that hundreds of later writers would follow. That template worked like this: acknowledge Plato's account as the source material, cite it respectfully, then elaborate far beyond what Plato actually said. Bring in evidence from multiple fields: archaeology, geology, mythology, linguistics, anthropology, creating an impression of thorough interdisciplinary research. Make bold claims about revolutionizing our understanding of history. Suggest that mainstream scholars are overlooking or suppressing important truths. In the decades following Donnelly's book, many other writers produced their own Atlantis theories. Some accepted Donnelly's basic framework and tried to build on it. Others proposed radically different locations or interpretations. The Atlantis field became crowded with competing theories, each claiming to have solved the mystery. One factor that made Atlantis theories proliferate was the genuine explosion of archaeological discovery in the 19th century. Archaeologists were finding spectacular remains of ancient civilizations. Heinrich Schliemann discovered Troy in the 1870s, proving that a city described in Homer's supposedly mythical epics had really existed. If Troy was real, why not Atlantis? The decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphics in 1822 by Jean-François Champollion had opened up ancient Egyptian texts to scholarly study. The excavation of Assyrian and Babylonian sites revealed sophisticated civilizations that had been lost to history. In the Americas, explorers were finding incredible ruins of Mayan and Aztec cities, often overgrown by jungle. All of these discoveries showed that the ancient world was more complex and accomplished than many people had realized. Civilizations could rise to great heights and then vanish, leaving only ruins. Advanced knowledge could be lost. Perhaps in this context, Atlantis wasn't so implausible after all. However, there was a crucial difference between these real discoveries and Atlantis. Troy, Pompeii, Nineveh, and Palenque all left physical remains that could be excavated and studied. They left artifacts, buildings, inscriptions, and other tangible evidence. Atlantis left nothing. Every search for physical remains of Atlantis came up empty. This lack of evidence didn't deter the believers. They developed explanations for why Atlantis hadn't been found. Perhaps it was in a location that hadn't been searched yet. Perhaps it was too deep underwater to be accessible to current technology. Perhaps evidence had been found but was being suppressed by authorities who didn't want to admit they were wrong. These arguments would become standard features of pseudo-archaeology and pseudoscience. When the evidence doesn't support your theory, question the evidence, question the authorities, suggest conspiracy or cover-up. This pattern would appear again and again in fringe theories about everything from ancient astronauts to lost continents. The late 19th century also saw the rise of Theosophy, a spiritual movement founded by Helena Blavatsky. Theosophy claimed to synthesize science, religion, and philosophy, drawing on Eastern and Western esoteric traditions. Blavatsky and her followers incorporated Atlantis into their cosmology in ways that went far beyond anything Plato had written. In theosophical teaching, Atlantis became one of several lost continents, home to the fourth of 7 root races of humanity. The Atlanteans were described as having psychic powers and advanced technology. They had been destroyed because they misused their abilities for selfish purposes. Some Atlanteans escaped the catastrophe and founded colonies, becoming the ancestors of various modern peoples. Blavatsky claimed to have accessed this knowledge through psychic means, reading from Akashic records, a sort of cosmic memory bank. She described Atlantean history in elaborate detail, naming cities, describing technologies, and recounting the moral decline that led to catastrophe. None of this came from Plato, who had mentioned nothing about psychic powers or cosmic records. Theosophy added mystical and occult elements to the Atlantis legend that have remained part of popular conceptions ever since. The idea that Atlanteans possessed powers and knowledge lost to modern humanity, that they could be contacted through spiritual means, that their wisdom might be recovered through esoteric practices. All of these notions trace back to Theosophy and similar movements. These occult interpretations appealed to people dissatisfied with both conventional religion and materialistic science. Atlantis became part of an alternative vision of human history, one in which spiritual evolution was as important as physical evolution, in which ancient peoples possessed wisdom that modern civilization had lost, in which the material world studied by science was only part of a deeper reality. The early 20th century would see even more elaborate development of these themes. Atlantis would be incorporated into new religious movements, alternative archaeologies, and popular entertainment. But the foundations were laid in the 19th century, particularly in the decades following Donnelly's influential book. It's worth noting that during this same period, some scholars were developing more plausible ideas about what might have inspired Plato's Atlantis story. They noted parallels between Atlantis and real historical events or places that Plato might have known about. One popular theory connected Atlantis to the Minoan civilization of Crete. The Minoans had indeed created a sophisticated Bronze Age culture with impressive palaces, advanced art, and extensive trade networks. Around 1500 before the Common Era, Minoan civilization had been severely damaged, possibly by the massive volcanic eruption of Thera, known today as Santorini. This eruption was one of the largest in human history. It destroyed the island of Thera itself and sent tsunamis crashing into Crete, about 70 miles away. The eruption might have been visible and audible hundreds of miles away. It certainly would have been remembered as a catastrophic disaster. Could stories of this disaster have reached Egypt and been transformed over centuries into the tale that Plato recounted? It was plausible. The chronology would need to be adjusted, Plato's 9,000 years reduced to 900 or even less. The location would shift from the Atlantic to the Mediterranean. But the core story of an advanced island civilization destroyed by volcanic catastrophe would remain. This theory had the advantage of connecting Atlantis to real historical events while explaining why no physical evidence existed for Atlantis in the Atlantic. It treated Plato's account as containing genuine historical memory, transmitted through Egyptian sources, but garbled and exaggerated in transmission. However, this theory also had problems. Crete itself didn't sink. The Minoans, while impressive, didn't match Plato's descriptions of Atlantean power and extent. And Plato specifically located Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Heracles, not in the Mediterranean. Adjusting the location required believing that Plato or his sources had gotten this crucial detail completely wrong. As the 19th century ended and the 20th began, the scholarly consensus was moving firmly away from belief in Atlantis as anything but philosophical allegory. But popular fascination was moving in the opposite direction. Atlantis was becoming more popular, more elaborated, more central to alternative visions of human history than ever before. This divergence created two separate Atlantises, one might say. The Atlantis of scholarship, a literary device created by Plato for philosophical purposes, mentioned occasionally in academic discussions of Plato's work but not taken seriously as history. And the Atlantis of popular culture, a real lost civilization whose rediscovery would change everything, whose memory inspired countless theories, expeditions, and spiritual movements. These two Atlantises exist side by side to this day. You can read scholarly books about Plato that treat Atlantis as obviously fictional. And you can read popular books claiming that Atlantis definitely existed and proposing new evidence for its location. The conversation between these perspectives is limited. They operate in different worlds with different standards of evidence, different goals, different audiences. Your eyelids are growing heavier now. The story flows around you like water, cool and soothing. You don't need to hold on to these details, just let them drift through your awareness like clouds across a twilight sky. The rhythm of the narrative carries you gently forward, deeper into relaxation, closer to sleep. The 20th century saw Atlantis explode into popular culture while simultaneously becoming ever more divorced from serious scholarship. It was a paradox. The more firmly scholars dismissed Atlantis as fiction, the more energetically believers promoted it as fact. One of the most influential Atlantis believers of the early 20th century was Edgar Cayce, known as the Sleeping Prophet. Cayce was an American psychic who claimed to enter trance states in which he could access universal knowledge and provide medical diagnoses, past life readings, and historical information. Between 1923 and 1944, Cayce gave hundreds of readings that mentioned Atlantis. These readings presented an elaborate history of Atlantean civilization that went far beyond anything Plato had written. According to Cayce's visions, Atlantis had existed for thousands of years, from around 200,000 to 10,000 before the Common Era. The Atlantis described by Cayce was technologically advanced far beyond the ancient world Plato had described. Cayce spoke of Atlanteans using electricity, aircraft, and powerful crystals that harnessed energy in ways modern science couldn't match. They had developed methods of communication and transportation that seemed almost magical. Some had psychic abilities that allowed them to manipulate matter with thought. According to Cayce's readings, Atlantis hadn't been destroyed all at once. Instead, there had been three major catastrophes spread over thousands of years. The first occurred around 50,000 before the Common Era, breaking the single continent into islands. The second happened around 28,000 years ago, further fragmenting the land. The final destruction came around 10,600 before the Common Era, when the remaining islands sank beneath the waves. Cayce claimed that before this final cataclysm, many Atlanteans had fled to other parts of the world, carrying their knowledge with them. They settled in Egypt, Yucatan, and other locations, influencing the civilizations that would rise there. This explained, according to Cayce, why advanced architectural and astronomical knowledge appeared suddenly in places like Egypt and Central America. Furthermore, Cayce predicted that Atlantis would rise again. He said that in 1968 or 1969, parts of Atlantis would be discovered near Bimini in the Bahamas. When divers did find what appeared to be stone structures off Bimini in 1968, some took this as confirmation of Casey's psychic powers. However, geologists who examined these Bimini Road stones concluded they were natural formations, beach rock that had fractured in regular patterns that only looked artificial. This scientific conclusion didn't deter believers, who insisted the structures were real and that mainstream science was either wrong or deliberately hiding the truth. Casey's influence on popular conceptions of Atlantis cannot be overstated. He transformed Atlantis from an ancient civilization described by Plato into a super-advanced culture with mystical powers and futuristic technology. This version of Atlantis would appear again and again in popular culture, from books to films to television shows. The early 20th century also saw the development of various fringe theories connecting Atlantis to other alternative historical ideas. Some writers claimed that Atlanteans had been in contact with extraterrestrials, that their advanced technology came from alien visitors. Others suggested that survivors of Atlantis had built the pyramids, Stonehenge, and other ancient monuments around the world. These theories ignored the extensive archaeological evidence about how these structures were actually built by the cultures credited with building them. They also ignored the enormous chronological problems with such claims. But they appealed to people who found conventional history boring or who were attracted to mysterious, dramatic alternatives to academic consensus. One persistent idea was that there were secret records of Atlantis hidden somewhere, waiting to be discovered. Casey had spoken of Hall of Records chambers in Egypt and Yucatan containing Atlantean knowledge. Others claimed that the Vatican possessed ancient texts about Atlantis that it kept secret. Still others suggested that certain secret societies had preserved Atlantean wisdom through the centuries. These claims about hidden knowledge served a psychological function. They suggested that important truths were being kept from ordinary people by authorities, whether governments, churches, or academic institutions. Discovering these truths would overturn conventional understanding and reveal that the world was far more mysterious and exciting than the establishment admitted. During World War II and the immediate post-war period, some truly bizarre Atlantis theories emerged from Nazi ideology. Heinrich Himmler and other Nazi leaders were interested in occult and mystical ideas about Aryan racial origins. Some Nazi theorists claimed that the Aryan race had originated in Atlantis, that the Atlanteans were the supreme humans whose descendants were the Germanic peoples. These repulsive racial theories had no basis in anything Plato wrote or in any legitimate historical or archaeological evidence. They were pure fabrication, designed to support the Nazis' evil ideology of racial supremacy. After the war, these ideas were thoroughly discredited, though they occasionally resurface in neo-Nazi literature. The post-war period also saw the development of scientific oceanography and plate tectonics theory. As scientists mapped the ocean floor and understood how continents moved over geological time, it became clear that no continent-sized land mass had existed and sunk in the Atlantic Ocean in the time frame proposed by Atlantis believers. The mid-Atlantic ridge, where some placed Atlantis, was actually spreading apart, not sinking. The geology simply didn't support the Atlantis story as literally true. This scientific evidence should have settled the question definitively. But by this point, Atlantis had become too deeply embedded in popular imagination to be dislodged by mere facts. Believers simply rejected or ignored the scientific findings, or they moved Atlantis to a new location where it would be harder to disprove. As the 20th century progressed, Atlantis appeared increasingly in popular entertainment. Science fiction writers used Atlantis as a setting for adventures. Comic books featured Atlantean civilizations beneath the sea. Television shows incorporated Atlantis into their storylines. In 1936, the animated film, The Lost Continent, was planned but never completed. In later decades, numerous films would feature Atlantis, though usually with stories that had little relation to Plato's original account. The 1978 film Warlords of Atlantis portrayed Atlantis as an underground city ruled by aliens. The 1991 TV movie, Atlantis, starred scientists discovering the lost city. But the most culturally significant Atlantis film came in 2001, when Disney released Atlantis, The Lost Empire. This animated adventure film followed a young linguist and a diverse crew of explorers who discover the lost city still inhabited by descendants of the original Atlanteans. Disney's Atlantis, The Lost Empire, drew inspiration from Jules Verne's adventure novels and interestingly from Edgar Cayce's psychic readings. The filmmakers incorporated Cayce's idea of a powerful crystal that gave the Atlanteans their energy and longevity. The film presented Atlantis as possessing advanced technology that blended ancient aesthetic with futuristic function. Set in 1914, the film featured impressive animation of the lost city itself, creating a majestic vision of Atlantean architecture and culture. Linguist Mark Okrand even created a functional Atlantean language for the film, designed to be a possible ancient root language for modern tongues. The film was a departure from typical Disney animated features. It had no musical numbers, focused on action and adventure rather than romance, and featured a more diverse cast than was common in Disney films at that time. The filmmakers were trying to create something that felt more like live-action adventure films in the tradition of Indiana Jones. However, Atlantis, The Lost Empire, was not the commercial success Disney had hoped for. Released in June 2001, it had to compete with the hugely successful Shrek, and struggled to find its audience. Critics gave it mixed reviews, and it earned less than $200 million worldwide on a budget that may have been as high as $120 million. The film's underperformance led Disney to cancel planned spin-offs, including a television series and a submarine ride at Disneyland. Only a direct-to-video sequel was produced. Despite this, Atlantis, The Lost Empire, has developed a devoted fan base over the years, with many considering it an underrated gem in Disney's catalog. The film's visual design was particularly praised. Production designer Mike Mignola, creator of the Hellboy comic series, brought his distinctive artistic style to the project, giving Atlantis a unique look that set it apart from other animated films. The city itself was rendered with impressive detail and grandeur, perhaps the most visually stunning depiction of Atlantis in popular media. Throughout the 20th century, Atlantis had also become a fixture in literature. Countless novels featured Atlantis as a setting or plot element. Some were serious attempts to imagine what an ancient advanced civilization might have been like. Others were pure adventure yarns using Atlantis as an exotic backdrop. Science fiction writers found Atlantis particularly useful. They could place advanced technology in an ancient setting, creating interesting contrasts and storylines. Fantasy writers used Atlantis as a source of magic and lost lore. Mystery writers crafted stories about searches for Atlantean artifacts or lost Atlantean knowledge. The Atlantis motif also appeared in video games, from early adventure games to modern massive multiplayer online games. Players could explore virtual Atlantises, discover its secrets, and battle its enemies. These interactive experiences gave people the chance to immerse themselves in Atlantean worlds in ways that passive entertainment couldn't match. Comic books created entire mythologies around Atlantis. DC Comics' Aquaman is the king of Atlantis, ruling an underwater civilization of mere people descended from ancient Atlanteans. Marvel Comics has its own version of Atlantis, home to Namor the Submariner. These fictional Atlantises bore little resemblance to Plato's description but had become established parts of superhero lore. What all of these popular culture depictions shared was a sense that Atlantis represented something lost and magnificent, a golden age when humanity had achieved greatness that was then destroyed by catastrophe or human folly. Whether the destruction came from natural disaster, divine punishment, war, or misuse of technology varied, but the basic pattern remained: rise, greatness, corruption, and fall. This narrative resonated because it spoke to real human experiences and fears. Civilizations do rise and fall. Great achievements can be lost. Knowledge can be forgotten. War, natural disaster, and poor decisions can destroy what took generations to build. Atlantis became a symbol of these universal patterns, a mythic embodiment of civilization's fragility. By the end of the 20th century, Atlantis occupied a curious position in Western culture. Almost no serious scholars believed it had existed as Plato described it. But in popular imagination, it was more vivid and real than ever. Millions of people believed, at least in some vague way, that Atlantis had been real, even if they couldn't point to specific evidence. This divergence between scholarly consensus and popular belief would continue and even intensify in the 21st century. The internet would allow Atlantis enthusiasts to connect, share theories, and reinforce each other's beliefs. Television documentaries would present Atlantis theories uncritically, treating speculation as serious investigation. And the legend would continue to evolve, adapting to each new generation's concerns and fascinations. Let your breathing grow slower now, deeper and more regular. Feel yourself sinking into comfort, into rest. The story continues, flowing like a river, but you don't need to hold on to every detail. Just let it carry you along, gentle and soothing, toward the deep waters of sleep. As we moved into the 21st century, the Atlantis phenomenon entered a new phase. The internet revolutionized how information and misinformation spread. Anyone could publish theories about Atlantis online, reaching global audiences without needing publishers or broadcasters. This democratization of content creation meant that Atlantis theories proliferated as never before. Television also played a major role in keeping Atlantis in public consciousness. The History Channel, once focused on conventional historical documentaries, increasingly featured programs about ancient mysteries, alternative archaeology, and fringe theories. Atlantis was a frequent subject. These shows often followed a similar formula. They would present Plato's account, then interview various people who had theories about where Atlantis really was or what really happened to it. Mainstream archaeologists might appear briefly to offer skeptical perspectives, but they were usually outnumbered by enthusiasts and alternative researchers. The shows were edited to suggest that the questions remained open, that Atlantis might really have existed, that perhaps the next expedition would finally find it. One particularly influential program was Ancient Aliens, which began airing in 2009. This series proposed that extraterrestrial visitors had influenced ancient human civilizations, building monuments and sharing advanced knowledge. Atlantis fit neatly into this framework. Some episodes suggested that Atlanteans had been in contact with aliens, or even that Atlantis itself had been an alien colony. These shows were enormously popular, despite being rejected by the academic community. They appealed to viewers who found conventional history dry or limiting, who wanted to believe that the past was more mysterious and exciting than textbooks suggested. The production values were high, the narration dramatic, and the theories presented as serious possibilities rather than wild speculation. Critics pointed out numerous problems with these programs. They cherry-picked evidence, ignored contrary facts, presented speculation as established fact, gave equal weight to trained experts and untrained enthusiasts, and used dramatic music and editing to make ordinary things seem mysterious. But these criticisms didn't diminish the show's popularity. If anything, accusations of bias from mainstream academia only made the programs more appealing to their core audience. The internet also enabled the spread of ever more elaborate Atlantis theories. Websites and forums dedicated to Atlantis hosted passionate debates about its location, technology, culture, and fate. YouTube channels offered video essays presenting new evidence or reinterpreting old evidence. Social media allowed Atlantis believers to form communities, sharing articles, images, and ideas. One effect of this online ecosystem was the creation of echo chambers where alternative theories about Atlantis could flourish without serious challenge. If someone proposed that Atlantis had been in Antarctica, or that it was actually an alien spaceship, or that its survivors had founded all ancient civilizations, they could find audiences who would take these ideas seriously. Criticism from outside these communities could be dismissed as closed-mindedness or evidence of conspiracy to suppress truth. The 21st century also saw continued attempts to locate Atlantis through exploration and research. Expeditions searched the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, the Caribbean, and even more exotic locations. Each would generate media coverage, documentary films, and renewed public interest. Similar claims and subsequent debunkings have occurred repeatedly. In 2011, a researcher claimed to have found Atlantis in southern Spain, buried in marshlands. The theory suggested that a tsunami had destroyed a Bronze Age civilization there, and that this was the real Atlantis. While the researcher found some archaeological evidence of ancient settlement, nothing connected it definitively to Plato's account. Google Earth has been both a blessing and a curse for Atlantis research. The ability to examine satellite and sonar imagery of the entire planet from home has allowed amateur researchers to spot features they think might be Atlantean. Regular patterns on the ocean floor, unusual shapes, or anything that looks vaguely artificial can spark new Atlantis claims. Most of these Google Earth discoveries turn out to be data artifacts, processing errors, or natural formations that happen to have regular shapes. But each generates excitement among believers and often media coverage before being explained away. The cycle of claim, publicity, debunking, and then new claim from a different source continues endlessly. One persistent modern location theory places Atlantis in Antarctica. Proponents of this idea suggest that Antarctica was once in a more temperate location before continental drift moved it to the South Pole, or that the continent was ice-free until a relatively recent catastrophe froze it. Advanced radar mapping has shown features beneath Antarctica's ice sheet, and some interpret these as possible evidence of ancient civilization. However, this theory faces insurmountable problems. Antarctica has been in its current polar position for tens of millions of years, not thousands. The ice sheet covering it has existed for millions of years. No credible geological evidence supports a recent shift or freezing. And no artifacts or other evidence of human habitation have been found in accessible areas of Antarctica. The appeal of Antarctica as Atlantis's location seems to be precisely its inaccessibility. If Atlantis is under miles of ice at the South Pole, then no one can easily disprove its existence there. This is similar to why some people placed Atlantis in the deep ocean. The harder it is to search a location, the safer it is as a proposed site for Atlantis. Modern Atlantis theories often incorporate elements from other alternative historical ideas. Ancient astronaut theories, hollow earth theories, lost continent theories about Mu or Lemuria, all these can be woven together with Atlantis into elaborate alternative histories of the world. In these grand narratives, Atlantis becomes part of a vast hidden history that mainstream academia refuses to acknowledge. These syncretistic theories appeal to people who distrust conventional authorities and expertise. They create an alternative knowledge system where true understanding comes not from universities and peer-reviewed research, but from independent researchers, ancient texts, mystical insights, and connecting dots that the mainstream overlooks. Psychologically, believing in Atlantis and related alternative histories can serve various needs. It makes the world more mysterious and interesting. It suggests that ordinary people, not just credentialed experts, can discover important truths. It provides a community of like-minded believers. It offers the pleasure of feeling that you know something others don't, that you've seen through the lies and limitations of conventional thinking. For some people, Atlantis also connects to spiritual or religious beliefs. New Age movements have long incorporated Atlantis into their cosmologies. The idea that ancient peoples possessed spiritual wisdom lost to modern materialistic civilization resonates with those dissatisfied with contemporary Western culture. Atlantis becomes a symbol of this lost wisdom, a time when humans lived in harmony with nature and the divine. Various modern spiritual teachers claim to channel Atlantean spirits or access Atlantean knowledge through meditation, past life regression, or psychic means. They offer courses, books, and workshops promising to help people reconnect with their Atlantean past or recover Atlantean healing techniques, crystal work, or other practices. From a scientific and historical perspective, these claims are unfounded. There's no mechanism by which someone could actually channel Atlantean spirits or remember Atlantean past lives, because Atlantis as described didn't exist. But for believers, personal spiritual experience trumps external evidence. If someone feels they've contacted Atlantean wisdom, that subjective experience can be more convincing than any scholarly argument. The tourism industry has also capitalized on Atlantis's enduring appeal. Numerous locations around the world claim connections to Atlantis and promote tourism based on these claims. Santorini in Greece heavily markets itself as a possible inspiration for Plato's story. Hotels, restaurants, and shops use Atlantis branding. Tour guides tell visitors about the volcanic eruption that might have inspired the Atlantis legend. Similar Atlantis-themed tourism exists in the Bahamas, Canary Islands, Spain, Morocco, and elsewhere. Each location has its proponents arguing for why it is the true site of Atlantis, and each welcomes tourists willing to spend money exploring the connection. For these communities, whether Atlantis really was there is less important than whether people believe it might have been. Luxury resorts have also adopted the Atlantis name and theme. The most famous is probably Atlantis Paradise Island in the Bahamas, a massive resort complex featuring aquariums, water parks, hotels, casinos, and other attractions all themed around an imagined Atlantis. Similar resorts exist in Dubai and elsewhere, trading on the Atlantis brand to suggest luxury, mystery, and exotic adventure. These commercial uses of Atlantis are far removed from Plato's philosophical allegory. They treat Atlantis as a fantasy brand, divorced from questions of historical truth. It's telling that this commercial Atlantis flourishes even as scholarly consensus firmly rejects Atlantis's literal existence. The myth has transcended the question of whether it's true, becoming valuable simply as a recognizable symbol. In literature, Atlantis remains a popular setting and subject. Authors continue to publish Atlantis novels, both fiction and purported non-fiction. Fiction writers enjoy the freedom to imagine Atlantean society however they wish, creating adventures in a lost world. Some books stay closer to Plato's account, while others elaborate far beyond it. The non-fiction Atlantis books range from serious scholarly works analyzing Plato's text and possible inspirations, to speculative works proposing new theories about where Atlantis was or what really happened to it, to outright pseudo-archaeological works making claims unsupported by evidence. Unfortunately, the speculative and pseudo-archaeological works often outsell the scholarly ones, as they promise revelation and mystery rather than careful analysis. Television series have featured Atlantis as well. The science fiction show, Stargate Atlantis, which ran from 2004 to 2009, was set in a city-sized spaceship called Atlantis located in the Pegasus galaxy. While obviously fictional, the show's premise that Atlantis had been a vessel built by advanced aliens who visited Earth drew on alternative historical theories even as it departed radically from them. The Disney Channel produced a direct-to-video sequel to Atlantis, The Lost Empire, in 2003 titled Atlantis, Milo's Return. This compilation of what were originally planned as television episodes saw the characters from the first film having new adventures with Atlantean connections. While not as well regarded as the original film, it extended the Disney Atlantis franchise. Various other animated series, live-action shows, and films have featured Atlantis in supporting roles. It's become a standard element of the fantasy and science fiction toolkit, something audiences immediately recognize. Mention Atlantis, and people know you mean an advanced ancient civilization that sank beneath the waves, even if they know nothing about Plato or the actual legend's history. Video games continue to use Atlantis as a setting. The Tomb Raider series featured Atlantis in its first installment. The Age of Mythology strategy game includes Atlantean civilization as a playable faction. Numerous casual puzzle and adventure games have Atlantis themes. The massively multiplayer online game World of Warcraft doesn't have Atlantis per se, but it has several underwater civilizations clearly inspired by Atlantis legends. These games allow players to explore Atlantis in interactive, immersive ways. You can walk through Atlantean streets, discover its secrets, battle its guardians, or manage its resources. The experience is visceral and engaging in ways that reading about Atlantis can never be. For many young people, their first encounter with Atlantis comes through games rather than books or films. The ubiquity of Atlantis in popular culture means that almost everyone in Western society knows about it. Most people, if asked, could provide a basic description. An advanced ancient civilization that sank into the ocean. Many could name Plato as the original source. But few know the actual details of Plato's account, the philosophical context in which he wrote it, or the complex history of how the story has evolved over 2 millennia. This widespread but shallow knowledge creates an environment where misconceptions about Atlantis flourish. People think they know about Atlantis, so they don't feel they need to study it carefully. They're susceptible to claims that sound plausible because they fit the general Atlantis narrative they've absorbed from popular culture, even if those claims contradict Plato's actual text or ignore archaeological reality. The contrast between popular belief in Atlantis and scholarly consensus creates an interesting cultural divide. In academia, bringing up Atlantis as a real historical place is likely to damage your credibility. It's a marker of fringe thinking, of not understanding how historical and archaeological research works. But outside academia, belief in Atlantis's reality is common and unremarkable. This divide reflects broader tensions about expertise and authority in modern society. Who gets to decide what's true about the past? Credentialed academics with their peer-reviewed research and careful methodology? Or independent researchers, spiritual teachers, and ordinary people with their own theories and experiences? For many, the answer isn't obvious. Social media has intensified these debates. On platforms like Twitter, YouTube, and Reddit, anyone can share Atlantis theories and attract followers. Algorithms often promote engaging, dramatic content over accurate, measured content. A video claiming to show proof of Atlantis will get more views than a careful scholarly analysis explaining why Atlantis was likely fictional. This creates economic incentives for content creators to make bold, unsubstantiated claims. Despite all the searching, theorizing, and speculating, no physical evidence of Atlantis as Plato described it has ever been found. No artifacts bearing Atlantean writing. No ruins of the ringed city with its bronze and orichalc walls. No elephant bones from the island. Nothing that would conclusively prove Atlantis existed where and when Plato said it did. For scholars, this absence of evidence is decisive. In archaeology, you can't prove something didn't exist, but the complete lack of supporting evidence after extensive searching makes the existence of Atlantis extremely unlikely. Combined with the philosophical context of Plato's dialogues and the lack of any mention of Atlantis in other ancient sources despite extensive records from Egypt and elsewhere, the scholarly consensus is firm. Atlantis was Plato's invention. But for believers, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. They argue that Atlantis's destruction was so complete that evidence would be hard to find. Or that evidence has been found but suppressed. Or that we haven't looked in the right place yet. Or that future technology will finally allow us to discover what current methods cannot detect. These arguments make Atlantis effectively unfalsifiable. No matter how much we search without finding anything, there's always a reason why we haven't found it yet. This moves Atlantis from the realm of historical inquiry, where evidence matters, into the realm of faith, where belief persists regardless of evidence. As you listen to this story, feel yourself becoming heavier, more relaxed. Your muscles are loose. Your breathing is slow and steady. The narrative flows through your mind like a gentle stream, washing away tension, carrying you toward rest. You don't need to analyze or remember. Just allow yourself to drift along with the words, peaceful and calm. While popular culture continues to embrace Atlantis as a real lost civilization, the scientific and scholarly communities have long since moved past that question. For them, the interesting questions about Atlantis aren't whether it existed, but why Plato created the story and what real events or places might have inspired elements of it. We've already mentioned one possibility: the Minoan civilization of Crete and the volcanic eruption of Thera around 1500 before the Common Era. This remains one of the most plausible connections, though it requires significant adjustments to Plato's account. The Minoans were a sophisticated Bronze Age civilization that flourished on Crete and nearby islands in the Aegean Sea. They built impressive palaces, created beautiful art, developed a writing system, and engaged in extensive maritime trade. Their palace complex at Knossos was enormous and complex, with advanced features like indoor plumbing. Around 1500 before the Common Era, disaster struck. The volcanic island of Thera, about 70 miles north of Crete, exploded in one of the largest volcanic eruptions in recorded history. The eruption was far larger than the famous eruption of Vesuvius that destroyed Pompeii. It would have ejected massive amounts of ash into the atmosphere, generated enormous tsunamis, and been visible and audible across vast distances. The tsunami struck Crete's northern coast, destroying coastal settlements and ships. Ash fall would have damaged crops and buildings. The psychological impact would have been enormous. For people experiencing this catastrophe, it must have seemed like the gods were destroying the world. Minoan civilization declined significantly after this event, though whether the eruption was the primary cause remains debated. Other factors, including invasions or internal collapse, may have contributed. But the eruption certainly dealt a severe blow to Minoan power and prosperity. Could stories of this catastrophe have reached Egypt and been transmitted to Solon centuries later? It's possible. Egypt and Crete had trade relationships during the Bronze Age. Egyptian records from the period do mention events in the Aegean world, though nothing specifically about Thera's eruption or Minoan collapse. The timeline is one problem with identifying Atlantis with the Minoans. Thera erupted around 1500 before the Common Era. Solon visited Egypt around 590 before the Common Era, 900 years later. But Plato's account says the Egyptian priests told Solon that Atlantis had existed 9,000 years before, not 900. Some scholars suggest Plato or his sources made an error, confusing Egyptian numerical notation or misunderstanding the timeline. Others propose that Plato deliberately placed Atlantis in the distant past to make it more legendary and to distance it from verifiable historical events. Another problem is geography. Thera and Crete are in the Aegean Sea, very much within the Mediterranean, not beyond the Pillars of Heracles in the Atlantic. Plato was quite specific about Atlantis's location outside the Mediterranean. Changing this fundamental detail seems like a major revision. Still, the correspondences are intriguing. An advanced island civilization, destroyed by a massive natural catastrophe involving volcanic eruption and water. A Bronze Age timeframe. Maritime power. Artistic sophistication. If Plato did hear stories from Egypt about events in the Aegean during the Bronze Age, he might have incorporated elements of them into his Atlantis narrative while changing details to suit his philosophical purposes. Other natural disasters in the Mediterranean have also been proposed as possible inspirations. The ancient city of Helike on the Greek mainland was destroyed by an earthquake and tsunami in 373 before the Common Era, during Plato's lifetime. The city was submerged by the sea and disappeared. This was a local catastrophe, not remotely on the scale of Atlantis's destruction, but it demonstrated that cities could indeed be swallowed by water suddenly. Some researchers have looked beyond the Mediterranean. A few have proposed that Atlantis might have been inspired by the Iberian civilization of Tartessos, which existed in southwestern Spain around the time of Solon. Tartessos was wealthy, engaged in maritime trade, and then disappeared from the historical record mysteriously. However, evidence for identifying Tartessos with Atlantis is thin. Another approach focuses on Bronze Age civilizations around the Atlantic coast of Europe and Africa. Some megalithic structures and ancient settlements have been found in coastal areas that are now underwater due to sea level rise since the last ice age. Could these have inspired stories of lost lands that Plato heard about? The problem with these theories is that we have no evidence Plato knew about Atlantic coastal civilizations. The Greeks were primarily Mediterranean people. Their trade networks extended into the Black Sea and around the Mediterranean basin, but less so into the Atlantic. Information about Atlantic cultures would have been limited and secondhand at best. From a geological perspective, the question of whether a large island could have existed and then sunk in the Atlantic has been definitively answered. No. We understand plate tectonics now. We've mapped the ocean floor. We know the history of continental drift over millions of years. There is no geological evidence for a continent-sized or even large island landmass having existed in the Atlantic and then sinking within the time frame of human civilization. The mid-Atlantic ridge, the underwater mountain range running down the center of the Atlantic, is spreading apart, not sinking. New crust is being created there as tectonic plates diverge. This is the opposite of what would be needed for Atlantis to have sunk. Smaller islands have appeared and disappeared in the Atlantic due to volcanic activity. Islands near Iceland, for instance, have emerged from the ocean and sometimes disappeared again. But these are small volcanic islands, nothing like the large landmass Plato described. Sea levels have changed dramatically over geological time. During ice ages, when more water was locked up in ice sheets, sea levels were hundreds of feet lower than today. Land bridges appeared that are now underwater. Coastal areas that were once inhabited are now submerged. As ice melted after the last ice age, sea levels rose, flooding these areas. This process happened gradually over thousands of years, not in a single day and night as Plato described. And while it did submerge some inhabited areas, creating legitimate lost lands in a sense, these were extensions of existing continents and islands, not a separate Atlantic civilization of the kind Plato described. Some researchers have suggested that folk memories of post-ice age sea level rise, passed down through oral tradition for millennia, might have contributed to myths of lost lands and catastrophic floods. These myths appear in many cultures worldwide, from the biblical flood story to the Epic of Gilgamesh to legends from indigenous peoples around the globe. The universality of flood myths is interesting and requires explanation. The most likely explanation is that major floods are common and devastating natural disasters that would be deeply traumatic to communities experiencing them. Each culture developed its own flood narratives independently, or similar narratives were transmitted and adapted as cultures interacted. Some researchers have proposed that a specific catastrophic event, such as the flooding of the Black Sea when rising Mediterranean waters breached the Bosporus Strait, might have inspired flood myths that spread widely. This event, if it occurred as hypothesized, would have been dramatic and memorable, potentially entering mythological traditions. But connecting these flood myths to Atlantis specifically requires assuming that Plato's story preserves genuine memory of such events, transmitted through Egyptian sources. Most scholars consider this unlikely. The specific details of Plato's Atlantis narrative, the ringed city, the 10 kings descended from Poseidon, the war with Athens, seem too elaborate and specific to be distorted memories of real events. Instead, most scholars interpret Atlantis as Plato's deliberate creation, a philosophical thought experiment dressed up as ancient history. The story served multiple purposes in his work. It illustrated his political theories about ideal and corrupt states. It demonstrated the cyclical nature of civilization that he believed in. It provided a dramatic prelude to the cosmological discussions that were the real focus of the Timaeus dialogue. The framing of the story, with its layers of transmission from Egyptian priests to Solon to Critias' grandfather to Critias to Socrates and finally to Plato's readers, created an impression of authenticity. But this was a literary device, a way of making the story more vivid and memorable, not a claim that it was literally historically accurate. Plato knew his audience. He knew that vivid narrative would engage readers more effectively than abstract philosophical argument. By presenting his ideas about politics and society through the story of Atlantis, he made those ideas more accessible and memorable. The story wasn't meant to deceive but to teach, to make people think about the nature of good government and the dangers of corruption and imperial ambition. In this interpretation, asking whether Atlantis really existed misses the point. It's like asking whether the characters in Plato's dialogues really said exactly what he wrote. Plato was creating philosophy through literature, using narrative and dialogue to explore ideas. Atlantis was a tool in that creative philosophical project. The tragic irony is that this tool became so compelling that it overwhelmed Plato's intended message. People became fixated on whether Atlantis was real and where it might have been, rather than on the ethical and political lessons Plato was trying to teach. The medium became the message in Marshall McLuhan's famous phrase, "This isn't entirely Plato's fault." He couldn't have anticipated how his story would be received by readers 2,000 years later, in cultures very different from his own. He couldn't have known that new continents would be discovered in the Atlantic, that geological science would develop, that his story would be incorporated into religious and mystical movements he could never have imagined. But the fact remains that the story of Atlantis escaped Plato's control and took on a life of its own. It became what folklorists call an independent narrative, a story that exists separate from its original context and author, evolving as it passes through different cultures and time periods. In this independent existence, Atlantis has served many purposes. It's been a lost golden age for romantics, a source of ancient wisdom for mystics, an advanced civilization for alternative historians, a science fiction setting for authors, a brand for resorts, and a symbol of civilization's fragility. Each generation and each subculture has shaped Atlantis to serve its needs. Modern archaeological and historical methods have given us unprecedented ability to recover and understand the past. We can read ancient languages that were once lost. We can date artifacts with remarkable precision. We can analyze ancient DNA and reconstruct diets and diseases. We can map trade networks and cultural influences. Applied to the question of Atlantis, these methods give us a clear answer. There is no archaeological or historical evidence for Atlantis as Plato described it. This doesn't mean the ancient world holds no more mysteries. New discoveries are made regularly. But Atlantis, as a literal historical place, is not one of those mysteries. It's a myth, and a fairly young one in archaeological terms, created in the 4th century before the Common Era by a specific author for specific purposes. Understanding this doesn't diminish Atlantis's cultural importance or its value as a story. Myths are important. They carry meaning, teach lessons, and inspire imagination even when they're not literally true. The Atlantis myth has enriched human culture for over 2,000 years. It's given us great stories, beautiful art, and food for thought about civilization's rise and fall. But it's crucial to distinguish between appreciating a myth and mistaking it for history. When people build entire alternative versions of human history on the foundation of Atlantis's reality, they're constructing on sand. When resources are devoted to searching for something that doesn't exist, those resources could be used for genuine historical and archaeological research. The persistence of belief in Atlantis despite overwhelming evidence against it reflects broader issues about how people evaluate evidence, whom they trust, and how they understand the past. These are important questions that extend far beyond Atlantis to affect everything from science education to public policy. Your eyes are closed now or growing very heavy. Your body is completely relaxed. The story washes over you like gentle waves on a shore, rhythmic and soothing. Let yourself sink deeper into rest. The journey through time continues, but you need not hold on to every detail. Just breathe slowly and steadily and allow peace to fill you. We've traveled a long way together tonight, from ancient Athens to the modern world, following the story of Atlantis through more than 2,000 years of human history. We've seen how a story created by one man, Plato, for specific philosophical purposes, has transformed and multiplied, taking on meanings he never intended and reaching audiences he could never have imagined. What makes Atlantis so enduring? Why does this particular legend continue to captivate us when countless other ancient stories have been forgotten? Part of the answer lies in the story's inherent drama. A great civilization at the peak of its power and prosperity, suddenly destroyed in a single day and night, lost forever beneath the waves. It's a narrative that combines grandeur with tragedy, achievement with catastrophe. It reminds us of civilization's fragility, of how quickly everything we've built can be swept away. This theme resonates in every age. Whether we think of the fall of Rome, the collapse of the Maya, or more modern catastrophes, human history is full of reminders that civilizations are not permanent. Atlantis symbolizes this universal truth in its most dramatic form. It serves as a warning and a reminder: nothing lasts forever and hubris can lead to destruction. But Atlantis also represents something more hopeful: the possibility that there is more to our past than we know, that ancient peoples achieved things we're only beginning to understand, that wisdom and knowledge from the past might still be recovered. In a world where the future often seems uncertain and the present overwhelming, the idea that the past holds secrets and lost greatness has powerful appeal. Plato understood this appeal. He knew that stories of lost golden ages inspire us to reach for something better. Even if Atlantis never existed, the idea of Atlantis, the vision of a society that achieved greatness before falling, can motivate us to pursue excellence while warning us against the pride and corruption that lead to collapse. The scientific and historical truth about Atlantis, that it was Plato's philosophical creation rather than a real place, doesn't diminish these deeper truths. Myths don't have to be literally true to be meaningful. The questions Atlantis raises about civilization, about virtue and corruption, about human nature and divine justice, remain worth contemplating regardless of the story's factual status. What's problematic isn't believing in the power of the Atlantis myth, but confusing the myth with history. When people reject scientific evidence in favor of attractive but false claims about Atlantis, they're not just making a harmless mistake. They're training themselves to disregard evidence and expert consensus, habits of thought that can lead to poor decisions in other areas of life. The same critical thinking skills that lead scholars to conclude Atlantis was fictional are the skills we need to evaluate claims about health, politics, economics, and countless other topics. Teaching people to demand evidence, to distinguish reliable from unreliable sources, and to accept conclusions even when they're less exciting than alternatives, these are essential skills for navigating our complex world. In that sense, the Atlantis phenomenon is both a wonderful example of mythology's power and a cautionary tale about the importance of critical thinking. We can appreciate the story while recognizing it's a story. We can use it to explore important themes while not building our understanding of history on false foundations. As our long journey through Atlantis's history comes to a close, think about what this story has meant through the ages. To Plato, it was a teaching tool. To medieval scholars, a curiosity from pagan philosophy. To Renaissance explorers, a possible explanation for new discoveries. To 19th century enthusiasts, proof of lost wisdom. To 20th century mystics, a source of spiritual knowledge. To modern popular culture, an exciting setting for adventure and mystery. Each age has created the Atlantis it needed. And future generations will doubtless continue reinventing Atlantis to serve their purposes. The story is flexible enough, archetypal enough, to accommodate endless interpretations. It speaks to something deep in human psychology: our desire for lost greatness, our fear of catastrophic loss, our hope that more exists than meets the eye. Perhaps that's the real secret of Atlantis's endurance. It's not that the story is true in a historical sense. It's that the story is true in a deeper, mythological sense. It tells us something about ourselves, about what we hope for and what we fear, about our relationship to the past and our anxieties about the future. As long as civilizations rise and fall, as long as people wonder about the past and worry about the future, Atlantis will endure. It will continue to be rediscovered and reimagined. New theories will be proposed. New expeditions will search. New books and films and games will tell Atlantean stories. And through it all, Somewhere in the Aegean or beneath Antarctic ice, in deep Atlantic waters or in the human imagination where it has always truly existed, Atlantis waits. Not as a place to be found but as a story to be told and retold, a mirror in which we see our own hopes, fears and dreams reflected back to us. Your breathing is deep and slow now. Your body is heavy, completely relaxed. You've traveled through thousands of years, through countless interpretations and transformations of a single story. You've seen how ideas can persist and evolve, how narratives can take on lives of their own. But now the journey is complete. The story has been told. And all that remains is for you to drift into peaceful sleep, carrying with you perhaps a dream of ancient cities and lost wisdom, of ringed islands in the sea and civilizations vanished beneath the waves. The waves are washing over the island now, gentle and eternal. The lights of the city fade beneath clear water. And in the silence that follows, there is only peace. Only rest. Good night.